The gunshots cracked through the still Wyoming air like lightning as Hannah Hayes dove behind the weathered barn, her heart pounding against her ribs with such force she feared it might burst. It was 1876, and the promise of a new life in Sweetwater Springs had just erupted into chaos when Denton's gang had stormed into town, guns blazing and demands echoing through the dusty streets. Hannah pressed her back against the splintered wood of the barn, drawing her knees to her chest as tears burned hot trails down her dirt-smudged cheeks. The fabric of her once fine blue dress, now tattered and soiled from days of hard travel, snagged on the rough-hewn boards. Just 22 years old, she had left behind everything familiar in Boston following her parents' death, answering her uncle's invitation to join him out west. But when she'd arrived in town just hours ago, she discovered her uncle's homestead burned to the ground, the man himself nowhere to be found. "Check the buildings. Find that woman who saw us," a gruff voice bellowed from the direction of the general store. Hannah clamped a hand over her mouth to silence her ragged breathing. She had indeed seen them, watched in horror from the shadows as they'd gunned down the town sheriff in cold blood, not realizing one of the outlaws had spotted her watching from the window of the hotel. Footsteps crunched on the dry earth, growing closer. Hannah scrambled backward, deeper into the shadows, fighting the urge to cry out. Her hand closed around a rusted pitchfork, hardly adequate protection against bullets, but better than nothing. "I know you're around here somewhere, girl." The outlaw's voice was closer now, just on the other side of the barn. Hannah's fingers tightened around the pitchfork handle as a sob threatened to escape her throat. Then came the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked, followed by a voice as steady as bedrock and as dangerous as a coiled rattlesnake. "I believe you boys have overstayed your welcome in Sweetwater Springs." The outlaw spun around, cursing. 2 gunshots exploded in quick succession, followed by a thud that could only be a body hitting the ground. Hannah flinched, pressing herself harder against the barn wall, wondering if she had just traded one danger for another. Heavy boots approached, deliberately slow. Hannah raised the pitchfork, preparing to defend herself. A tall shadow fell across her hiding place. A man stood there, silhouetted against the setting sun, his broad shoulders topped by a worn Stetson. A Winchester rifle rested comfortably in his hands, but he wasn't aiming it at her. His face was partially obscured by several days' worth of stubble, but his eyes, a striking shade of green, were clear and direct as they found hers. "Madam," he said, his voice softer now but still carrying that note of steel, "those outlaws will be back with more men. You're safe with me, but we need to move quickly." Hannah remained frozen, the pitchfork still clutched in her trembling hands. "How do I know you're not one of them?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression softened slightly. "Name's Elijah Weston. I run the Cross W Ranch about 10 miles north of here. Sheriff Daniels was a good friend." He holstered his revolver and extended a hand toward her. "If you stay here, those men will find you. I can get you somewhere safe." Something in his steady gaze made Hannah believe him. Slowly, she lowered the pitchfork. "Hannah Hayes," she replied, placing her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, but his grip was gentle as he helped her to her feet. "I arrived today from Boston. I was supposed to meet my uncle, Charles Hayes, but his homestead is—" Her voice faltered. "Burned down last week," Elijah finished grimly. "Denton's gang. Your uncle managed to escape. He's recovering at Doc Miller's place outside of town." He glanced toward the main street where shouts could still be heard. "We need to go. My horse is behind the livery." Relief flooded through Hannah at the news her uncle was alive, but it was quickly replaced by fresh fear as gunshots rang out again, closer this time. "They're coming back this way," Elijah said, his voice urgent. "Can you ride?" Hannah nodded. "Yes, but not well. It'll have to do." Elijah led her around the back of the barn, keeping to the shadows. A magnificent black stallion stood waiting, pawing at the ground impatiently. With practiced ease, Elijah mounted, then reached down to pull Hannah up behind him. "Hold tight," he instructed as she settled awkwardly behind him, her skirts bunching uncomfortably. Hannah hesitated only a moment before wrapping her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. Elijah clicked his tongue, and the horse sprang forward just as shouts erupted behind them. A bullet whizzed past, close enough that Hannah felt the air disturbed by its passage. She buried her face against Elijah's back, terror and exhilaration mingling in her veins as they galloped away from Sweetwater Springs and into the gathering dusk. The moon was high overhead by the time they slowed their pace, the horse's sides heaving with exertion. Hannah's entire body ached from the unaccustomed riding, but she hadn't complained once. They had ridden hard across open rangeland, following what seemed to Hannah to be invisible trails, but Elijah navigated with the confidence of a man who knew every inch of this wild country. "Not much farther now," Elijah said, the first words either of them had spoken in hours. "Cross W is just beyond that ridge." Hannah nodded against his back, too exhausted to reply. The events of the day had finally caught up with her, and it was all she could do to maintain her grip around his waist. As they crested the ridge, a sprawling ranch came into view, bathed in silver moonlight. A large main house stood surrounded by several outbuildings, a corral, and a bunkhouse. A few lamps still glowed in windows despite the late hour. "Home," Elijah said simply, a note of pride in his voice that made Hannah smile despite her fatigue. As they approached the main house, a door swung open and a gray-haired woman stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "That you, Illy?" she called, her voice carrying clearly through the still night air. "It's me, Mrs. Cooper," Elijah replied, "and I've brought a guest who needs our help." The woman lowered her rifle as Elijah guided his horse to a halt in front of the porch. With gentle hands, he helped Hannah dismount, catching her when her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. "This is Hannah Hayes," Elijah explained to Mrs. Cooper as he steadied Hannah. "She's Charles Hayes's niece from back east, got caught up in some trouble with Denton's gang in town." Mrs. Cooper's weathered face creased with concern. "Lord have mercy. Come inside, child. You look dead on your feet." Hannah allowed herself to be led into the warm kitchen, where Mrs. Cooper, who introduced herself as the housekeeper and cook, quickly set about preparing a late supper while Elijah tended to his horse. "Illy's a good man," Mrs. Cooper said as she placed a steaming bowl of stew in front of Hannah. "Finest rancher in the territory and not afraid to stand up to the likes of Denton and his ilk." Hannah's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Who is Denton? Why did they kill the sheriff?" Mrs. Cooper's expression darkened. "Wade Denton. Used to be just another cattle rustler, but he's gotten bold these past few months. Runs a gang of about 15 men. They've been terrorizing the smaller ranches, stealing cattle, burning homesteads. Sheriff Daniels was getting too close to their hideout, I reckon." Hannah shivered, remembering the cold, calculating look in the outlaw's eyes as he'd searched for her. "And my uncle, Mr. Weston, said he was injured. Caught a bullet trying to defend his property," came Elijah's voice from the doorway. He'd removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Doc Miller says he'll recover, but it'll take time." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes again. "I need to see him." "Tomorrow," Elijah said firmly, pulling up a chair across from her. "The roads aren't safe at night, especially with Denton's men looking for you. Get some rest, and I'll take you to your uncle in the morning." Too exhausted to argue, Hannah nodded, finishing her stew in silence as Mrs. Cooper busied herself preparing a room for her. When she finally lay down in the clean, soft bed, sleep claimed her almost instantly, but not before an image of steady green eyes and a voice promising safety drifted through her mind. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Hannah woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. Mrs. Cooper had laid out a simple dress, belonged to Elise's sister before she married and moved to Denver, and helped Hannah wash her travel-worn clothes. When she emerged from her room, she found Elijah in the kitchen, studying a map spread across the table. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes that made Hannah's heart skip a beat. "Good morning, Miss Hayes. I trust you slept well." "Better than I expected, thank you, Mr. Weston." Hannah smoothed the borrowed dress, acutely aware that it fit her rather well if a bit loose in the waist. "And please call me Hannah." A small smile touched his lips. "Then you must call me Elijah." He gestured to the map. "I've been planning the safest route to Doc Miller's place. It's about an hour's ride from here." After a hearty breakfast, they set out, this time with Hannah riding a gentle mare that Elijah assured her was perfect for inexperienced riders. The Wyoming landscape stretched out around them, vast and beautiful in the morning light. Despite the circumstances, Hannah found herself marveling at the rugged grandeur of the mountains in the distance and the sea of grass that rippled in the breeze. "It's beautiful," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Different from anything I've ever seen." Elijah glanced at her, his expression softening. "It gets in your blood. I can't imagine living anywhere else. How long have you had your ranch?" Hannah asked, genuinely curious about this quiet, capable man who had saved her life. "Inherited it from my father 5 years ago," Elijah replied. "He came out here in '49, built it up from nothing. I've been adding to it ever since." Pride colored his voice. "We've got some of the finest cattle in the territory now. And your family," Mrs. Cooper mentioned a sister. "Rebecca, she's my only sibling. Our mother passed when I was 14. It's mostly just me and the ranch hands now, plus Mrs. Cooper, who's been with us since I was a boy." Hannah nodded, understanding the loss in his voice. "My parents died 6 months ago, influenza. They left me enough to live on, but the house." She swallowed hard. "Too many memories. When Uncle Charles wrote inviting me to Wyoming, it seemed like Providence." Elijah's eyes met hers, and in them, she saw genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry about your parents, and about what happened to your uncle's place. Wyoming can be harsh, but it's also a place for new beginnings." They arrived at Doc Miller's modest homestead just before noon. The doctor, a gruff, bearded man with kind eyes, led them to a small back room where Charles Hayes lay propped up against pillows, his shoulder heavily bandaged. "Uncle Charles." Hannah rushed to his bedside, tears of relief springing to her eyes. The older man's weathered face broke into a smile despite the pain evident in his eyes. "Hannah, my dear girl, I'm so sorry about the welcome or lack thereof." "Don't you dare apologize," Hannah said firmly, taking his hand. "I'm just thankful you're alive." Charles's eyes moved past Hannah to where Elijah stood in the doorway. "Weston, Mrs. Miller said you rode into town yesterday. I take it you're responsible for bringing my niece safely here." Elijah nodded. "Denton's men were looking for her." "They've grown bolder," shot Sheriff Daniels in broad daylight. Charles's expression darkened. "Daniels was a good man. This territory's going to hell without law enforcement." He looked back at Hannah. "You can't stay in Sweetwater Springs, not with Denton's gang running loose. It's not safe." "She can stay at Cross W until you're recovered," Elijah said, surprising Hannah. We've plenty of room and it's well defended." Hannah looked between the two men, uncertainty flickering across her face. "I don't want to impose nonsense," her uncle interrupted. "Weston's place is the safest in the territory. I'd feel better knowing you were there until I'm back on my feet." He squeezed her hand. "It won't be for long. Doc says I should be up and about in a few weeks." After spending several hours with her uncle, Hannah reluctantly prepared to leave as the afternoon waned. Before they departed, Doc Miller took Elijah aside, speaking in low, urgent tones that Hannah couldn't quite make out. Whatever was said caused Elijah's expression to harden, his jaw clenching as he nodded grimly. They rode in silence for the first few miles, Hannah lost in thoughts of her uncle's condition and the uncertain future ahead. Finally, she could bear it no longer. "What did Doc Miller tell you?" "Something about Denton." Elijah's shoulders tensed slightly before he answered. "Word is Denton's put a price on your head, $500 to anyone who brings you to him. He's convinced you can identify the men who killed Sheriff Daniels." Fear clutched at Hannah's heart. "I can," she admitted. "I saw their faces clearly from the hotel window. I could identify at least 3 of them." "Which is why you're staying at Cross W until this is resolved," Elijah said, his tone brooking no argument. "Denton can't touch you there." "But what about my uncle's homestead?" "Everything he worked for, first things first. We keep you safe, then worry about rebuilding." Elijah's voice softened. "You're not alone in this, Hannah." Something in his words and the way he said her name made warmth spread through Hannah's chest despite the danger they faced. This man she'd known for barely a day had risked his life for her, offered her sanctuary, and now spoke as though her problems were his own to solve. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate for the gratitude she felt. The days at Cross W fell into a rhythm. Hannah, determined not to be a burden, insisted on helping Mrs. Cooper with household tasks and quickly proved herself capable despite her city upbringing. She learned to make sourdough bread, mend shirts, and even assisted with the vegetable garden that supplied the ranch's kitchen. Elijah rode out early each morning to work with his men, returning in the evenings dusty and tired, but always taking time to sit with Hannah on the porch after supper, telling her stories about the land and listening to her tales of Boston with genuine interest. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. A week passed, then 2. Hannah rode with Elijah to visit her uncle twice more, relieved to see him improving steadily. But news from town grew increasingly worrying. Denton's gang had virtually taken over Sweetwater Springs in the absence of law enforcement, and the price on Hannah's head had doubled. "The territorial governor's been telegraphed," Elijah informed her after their second visit to Doc Miller's. "They're sending a U.S. Marshal, but it could be weeks before he arrives." Hannah's hands twisted in her lap. "I can't hide forever, Elijah. I'm putting you and everyone at Cross W in danger just by being here." "No one at Cross W goes unprotected," Elijah said firmly. "My men are loyal and well armed. Denton would be a fool to try anything." But the very next day, trouble found them. Hannah was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard the rapid approach of hoofbeats. One of Elijah's ranch hands, a young man named Tyler, galloped into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat. "Mr. Weston," he shouted. "Rustlers at the north pasture. They've got at least 20 head already." Elijah emerged from the barn, his expression hardening. "Get the men." "We ride in 5 minutes." Hannah watched with growing alarm as the ranch erupted into activity, men grabbing rifles and mounting horses. Elijah strode toward her, his face set in grim lines. "Stay in the house with Mrs. Cooper," he instructed, checking his revolver before holstering it. Keep the doors locked. Be careful, Hannah said, unable to hide the fear in her voice. Please. Something softened in Elijah's eyes. For a moment he looked as though he might say more, but instead he simply nodded before mounting his horse and leading his men out at a gallop. The hours that followed were some of the longest of Hannah's life. She paced the kitchen while Mrs. Cooper cleaned her shotgun and positioned herself by the window, her weathered face betraying no fear, only grim determination. "Eli knows what he's doing," the older woman assured Hannah. "He's dealt with rustlers before." But as dusk approached with no sign of the men returning, even Mrs. Cooper's confidence began to waver. When they finally heard horses approaching, both women rushed to the window, relief flooding through them at the sight of Elijah leading his men back to the ranch. Relief turned to horror, however, when Hannah realized Elijah was slumped in his saddle, his shirt dark with blood. "He's been shot." She gasped, rushing outside as the men carefully helped Elijah dismount. "It's not as bad as it looks," Elijah insisted through gritted teeth, though his ashen face belied his words. "Bullet just grazed my side." But when they got him inside and removed his shirt, Hannah saw that the wound was far from a graze. The bullet had torn through the flesh of his left side, leaving an ugly, bleeding gash. "Mrs. Cooper, I need hot water and clean cloths," Hannah ordered, falling back on the nursing skills she'd learned caring for her parents. "And your strongest whiskey." Working quickly, Hannah cleaned and bandaged the wound while Elijah lay stoically silent, only the occasional tightening around his eyes betraying his pain. When she finally tied off the last bandage, their eyes met, and something passed between them, something neither was ready to name but both felt with startling clarity. "Thank you," Elijah said quietly. Hannah managed a smile. "I believe we're even now, Mr. Weston." Later, after Elijah had been settled in his bedroom and Mrs. Cooper had gone to prepare a broth, Hannah sat beside his bed, her hands still faintly stained with his blood despite her scrubbing. "Was it Denton's men?" she asked. Elijah nodded, wincing as he shifted position. "Same brand on their horses as the men who burned your uncle's place. They were after more than cattle. This was a message." "Because of me," Hannah said, guilt washing over her. "I should leave, Elijah. I've brought nothing but trouble to you and your ranch." "No." The word came out sharp and definitive. Elijah reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his injury. "Denton was targeting Cross W long before you arrived, Hannah. I've been standing against him for months. This isn't your fault." His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, sending warmth up her arm. "Besides," he added, his voice softening, "having you here has been. I've grown accustomed to our evenings on the porch." Hannah felt her cheeks flush. "As have I." They fell silent, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Finally, Hannah stood, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from his. "You should rest. I'll check on you later." Elijah caught her wrist before she could turn away. "Hannah." He hesitated, then simply said, "Thank you for staying." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Rest, Elijah. We'll talk more tomorrow." As May turned to June, Elijah's wound healed steadily under Hannah's careful attention. Their bond deepened with each passing day, nurtured by shared confidences and mutual respect that gradually blossomed into something more. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elijah finally asked the question that had been weighing on his mind. "What will you do when your uncle recovers? Will you go back east?" Hannah considered the question carefully. "A month ago I might have said yes. Boston was all I knew." She looked out across the rolling grassland that surrounded Cross W, now as familiar to her as the city streets she'd grown up on. "But now, I'm not sure I could leave Wyoming. There's something about this place. It gets in your blood, Elijah finished, echoing his words from weeks earlier. Their eyes met, and Hannah felt her heart quicken. Yes, she said softly. It does. Elijah reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. I've been thinking, he began, then hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. Your uncle's homestead. It's good land, but rebuilding alone would be difficult. I could help my men and I. That's very generous, Hannah said, touched by the offer. There's more. Elijah took a deep breath. Cross W has prospered. I've been looking to expand eastward towards Sweetwater Springs. Your uncle's land would connect perfectly with mine. Hannah frowned slightly, confused. Are you proposing a business arrangement? A smile touched Elijah's lips. Not exactly. He shifted to face her more fully. Hannah, I know we've known each other only a short time, but these weeks, having you here. He faltered, then seemed to find his resolve. I'm not a man of flowery words, but I care for you deeply, more than I thought possible. Hannah's breath caught in her throat as Elijah continued, his voice growing more confident. I'm proposing a partnership, yes, but not just of land, of lives. His green eyes held hers steadily. I'm asking if you might consider staying at Cross W, not as a guest, but as my wife. Joy bubbled up inside Hannah, unexpected yet somehow inevitable. The answer formed in her heart before her mind had fully processed his words. Yes, she whispered. I would consider that very favorably indeed, Mr. Weston. Elijah's face broke into a smile of such radiance that Hannah felt her heart might burst. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was both achingly gentle and filled with promise. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. I should speak to your uncle, he murmured. Hannah laughed softly. I believe he'll approve. He's been singing your praises since I arrived in Wyoming. Their newfound happiness, however, was soon overshadowed by troubling news from town. 3 days after Elijah's proposal, a rider arrived from Sweetwater Springs with word that Denton's gang had been spotted heading toward Cross W, at least 15 men strong. They're coming for me, Hannah said, her face pale as Elijah gathered his men in the main house. For my testimony about the sheriff's murder. And they mean to settle scores with Cross W while they are at it, Elijah added grimly. We've got 8 men including myself. Not great odds, but we have the advantage of position. Mrs. Cooper stepped forward, her shotgun cradled in her arms. 9. I can shoot as well as any man here. 10, Hannah said firmly. When Elijah began to protest, she cut him off. I've been practicing with Mrs. Cooper. I can reload if nothing else. This is my fight too, Elijah. After a moment's hesitation, Elijah nodded, respect evident in his eyes. We'll fortify the house and barn. If they want a fight, we'll give them one they won't forget. The preparations were swift and efficient. Furniture was moved to block windows, ammunition distributed, positions assigned. By nightfall, Cross W had been transformed into a fortress, with every approach covered by at least one rifle. Hannah found Elijah in his study, reviewing a hand-drawn map of the ranch. Without a word, she crossed to him and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his back. We'll get through this, she said, willing herself to believe it. Elijah turned in her embrace, his hands coming up to frame her face. When this is over, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I'm taking you to Denver for a proper ring. And then we're going to build something no one can take from us. Hannah rose on her tiptoes to kiss him, pouring all her fear and hope and love into the gesture. I'll hold you to that promise, Elijah Weston. They came at dawn, just as the first pale light was breaking over the eastern horizon. Hannah, positioned at an upstairs window with a rifle and box of ammunition, spotted the dust cloud first. "They're coming," she called, her voice steady despite the fear knotting her stomach. Elijah appeared beside her, his face grim as he assessed the approaching riders. "At least 20. More than we expected." He squeezed her shoulder. "Remember, stay low and don't take unnecessary risks." The next hours passed in a blur of gunfire and smoke. Denton's men surrounded the ranch, firing from the cover of outbuildings and the nearby stream bed. The defenders of Cross W held their ground, picking their shots carefully, making each bullet count. Hannah reloaded rifles with trembling fingers, passed water to the men, and occasionally fired when a clear target presented itself. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the house, and the constant cracking of rifles made her ears ring. By mid-morning, 2 of Elijah's men had been wounded, though not seriously. But Denton's gang showed no signs of retreating, and ammunition was running low. "We need to break their momentum," Elijah said during a brief lull in the firing. His face was streaked with sweat and gunpowder, his eyes hard as flint. "They're concentrating their forces by the barn. If we could draw them out." Before he could finish his thought, a voice boomed from outside. "Weston, send out the woman and we'll let the rest of you live." Elijah's expression darkened. Wade Denton himself. I was wondering when he'd show his face. "You know I can identify him now," Hannah said quietly. "He'll never let me testify." "And I'll never let him take you," Elijah replied, his voice like steel. He turned to his foreman. "Davis, take 2 men and circle around to the creek bed. When you hear my signal, hit them from the flank." As Davis slipped out through a back window, Elijah checked his revolver with methodical precision. "I'm going to offer Denton something he wants more than you." Hannah grabbed his arm, alarm flashing across her face. "What are you planning?" "A distraction." Elijah's eyes softened as they met hers. "Trust me." Before she could protest further, he was moving toward the front door. Hannah followed, her heart in her throat, as Elijah positioned himself behind the heavy oak door. "Denton," he called out. "I'm coming out to talk terms. Hold your fire." "Elijah, no," Hannah whispered urgently, but he silenced her with a look that held both determination and tenderness. "Stay inside," he ordered, then more softly. "I love you, Hannah Hayes." Before she could respond, he had slipped outside, hands raised to show he was unarmed, though Hannah knew he had a revolver tucked at the small of his back, hidden by his vest. From her position by the window, Hannah watched as Elijah walked slowly into the yard. A large man with a shock of gray-streaked hair and a cruel mouth emerged from behind the barn, flanked by 2 gunmen. "Brave of you, Weston," Denton called, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Foolish, but brave." "I want to end this, Denton," Elijah replied evenly. "Too many good men have died already." Denton laughed, an ugly sound. "The only way this ends is with the girl in my custody and your ranch in ashes. You've been a thorn in my side for too long." "I have a counter-offer," Elijah said, taking another step forward. "I have something worth more than the girl's testimony or even Cross W." Denton's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And what might that be?" "Information. About the federal gold shipment coming through Sweetwater Springs next week." Elijah's voice was calm, convincing. 5,000 in freshly minted double eagles. I know the route and the escort size." Hannah's breath caught. There was no gold shipment. This was the distraction Elijah had mentioned. She watched, heart pounding, as Denton considered the offer, greed battling suspicion on his weathered face. "Why would you share this?" Denton demanded. "Because I want to live," Elijah replied simply. "And I want my ranch intact. The girl for the gold information, that's my offer." As Denton mulled this over, Hannah noticed subtle movement at the edge of the property. Davis and his men, working their way into position. Elijah had positioned himself perfectly, keeping Denton's attention focused away from their approach. "How do I know you're not lying?" Denton finally asked. "The same way I know you won't shoot me the moment I tell you, Faith." Elijah shrugged. "But if you want proof, I can describe the escort detail." 4 men, led by Captain James Fuller of the Elijah's words, were cut short by the crack of a rifle from somewhere to Hannah's left. She watched in horror as he staggered, clutching his shoulder. Blood blossomed on his shirt, bright against the white fabric. "No!" The scream tore from Hannah's throat before she could stop it. Without thinking, she grabbed her rifle and burst through the front door, firing wildly at Denton and his men. Her sudden appearance created the diversion Elijah had been planning. Davis and his men opened fire from their position by the creek, catching several of Denton's gang in a deadly crossfire. Confusion erupted as the outlaws scrambled for cover, unsure where to direct their return fire. Hannah raced to Elijah's side, heedless of the bullets flying around them. He had fallen to one knee, his face pale with pain but his eyes alert. "Damn it, Hannah," he gasped. "I told you to stay inside." "And I didn't agree to that," she retorted, slipping her shoulder under his uninjured arm to help him up. A shadow fell across them. Hannah looked up to find Wade Denton himself standing before them, his revolver aimed directly at her heart. "Touching," he sneered. "But this ends now." Time seemed to slow. Hannah saw Denton's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Elijah's hand moving toward the gun at his back, knowing he wouldn't be fast enough. Closed her eyes and waited for the impact. Instead, there came the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. "Drop it, Denton," came a familiar voice, steady and authoritative. Hannah's eyes flew open to see her uncle, Charles Hayes, sitting astride a horse just yards away, a shotgun leveled at Denton's head. Behind him rode at least a dozen men, all armed and grim-faced. "The U.S. Marshal arrived yesterday," Charles continued, satisfaction evident in his voice. "These gentlemen are deputized posses from 3 counties. You're surrounded." Denton's face contorted with rage, but even he could see the odds had turned against him. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. What followed was a blur of activity as Denton and his surviving men were disarmed and bound. The newly arrived marshal, a taciturn man named Hardin, personally secured Denton with handcuffs. "You'll hang for killing Sheriff Daniels," he informed the outlaw matter-of-factly. "Miss Hayes's testimony will see to that." As Denton was led away, Hannah turned her attention back to Elijah, who was being examined by a doctor who had accompanied the posse. "The bullet went clean through," the doctor announced. "He'll need rest, but he should make a full recovery." "He's stubborn that way," Hannah said, relief making her voice tremble as she gripped Elijah's hand. Her uncle approached, smiling despite the obvious stiffness in his movements. "When I heard Denton was heading this way, I rode straight to the marshal's camp. Seems I arrived just in time." "Perfect timing, Charles," Elijah agreed, wincing as the doctor began bandaging his shoulder. "Though I had the situation well in hand." "Of course you did," Hannah said dryly, though her eyes shone with love and relief. "Being shot was part of your brilliant plan, I suppose." "Any plan that ends with you safe is brilliant in my book," Elijah replied, his free hand coming up to touch her cheek gently. Charles Hayes looked between them, one eyebrow raised. "I see some things have developed in my absence." Hannah blushed but met her uncle's gaze squarely. "Elijah has asked me to marry him, Uncle. I've accepted." Charles studied Elijah for a long moment, then broke into a broad smile. "Well, it's about time. I was beginning to think you'd never get around to it, Weston." "You knew?" Hannah asked, surprised. My dear girl, I may be old, but I'm not blind. I saw the way he looked at you the day you arrived in Sweetwater Springs." Charles clasped Elijah's uninjured shoulder. "You have my blessing for whatever that's worth." "It's worth a great deal, sir," Elijah said sincerely. 3 months later, on a perfect September afternoon, Hannah Hayes became Hannah Weston in a ceremony held on the front porch of the newly expanded Cross W Ranch. Her uncle gave her away, his limp barely noticeable as they walked arm in arm to where Elijah waited, handsome in a new suit brought all the way from Denver. The ranch had recovered from the battle with Denton's gang. The damaged buildings had been repaired, and work had begun on connecting Cross W with Charles Hayes's rebuilt homestead. Wade Denton and 2 of his lieutenants had been tried and hanged for the murder of Sheriff Daniels, with Hannah's testimony providing the key evidence. As Hannah and Elijah exchanged vows before their friends, neighbors, and ranch hands, she reflected on how drastically her life had changed in just a few short months. The terrified young woman who had hidden behind a barn seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. After the ceremony, as guests enjoyed Mrs. Cooper's magnificent feast, Elijah led Hannah away from the celebration to a quiet spot overlooking the ranch. The setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light, turning the distant mountains to purple shadows. "Happy?" Elijah asked, his arms encircling her waist as she leaned back against his chest. "Completely," Hannah replied, turning in his embrace to face him. "Though I still can't believe how it all began, hiding behind that barn, thinking my life was over, and then you found me." Elijah smiled, the love in his eyes making Hannah's heart swell. "And do you remember what I told you? You said I was safe with you," Hannah recalled, rising on her tiptoes to brush her lips against his. "And I have been every day since." "Always," Elijah promised, gathering her closer. "For as long as I live." As they sealed their promise with a kiss, the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the Wyoming sky, witnesses to a love that had been forged in danger but would flourish in peace on the wild frontier they now called home.